for pitching on that kind of stuff. So I feel like it is really, really like tough to be able to save a drum take at that point once it's like, you know, dipped so far down or so far out of reach at that point.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, but like with like bass or vocals, we have a whole bunch of fun stuff. As far as like polyphonic sources, like guitar or like piano or anything like that, anything that has like any sort of harmonic information and is polyphonic, I feel like you can get in some weird territory. It can be done. Melodyne has a cool, like, the DNA sequence, so you can, like, expand out the chords, and I believe Logic now has something like that, and everyone has something like that now. But that, it gets into a weird thing. I was recording a jazz ensemble back at Philly Sound, and the Wurlitzer was like the key of E flat was 10 cents flat, and so threw it into Melodyne and clicked one button, brought that up, right. Everything was fine. So that I mean, it didn't save the performance. It definitely made it better, though. But yeah, so yeah.
I mean, sometimes, right, exactly. That's kind of like a really good example too when it comes to that like final like tuning and selecting the right comps, you know, that fit the song and the overall vibe. Sometimes, you know, it's not even like it becomes a relative thing with pitch a lot too, which is kind of this, you know, this last thing where you'll see. You know, different tracking approaches too. Sometimes, you know, especially in the world of overdubs, you know, sometimes if you're tracking a band, sometimes there's a reason to be like, hey, let's track and get everything that's hardest to stay in tune and play together first, so we know that's great. And then, for example, it's like, this is why some producers like to track bass last instead of right after drums, because you might lay down all the rhythm guitars, and if it's a really fast song or the guitarists are hammering it, the pitch of those guitars might be floating a little sharp, right? But if you're just right on with a bass, then you might go back, and then it might be like the guitarists are trying desperately to like tune. They're like diming the tuner, and they're like, it couldn't be more on right now. I don't know what to do. And it's just the intonation and pull. Whereas if you go back and the bass player is like, oh, I'm like, says I'm in tune, but it feels like I'm a little flat, then it's one easy thing where you just pull the bass up just a touch, and all of a sudden everything falls in line, right? And then you don't have to jump through hoops trying to auto-tune and whatever. Or you find the take that maybe they're pretty comparable, but one of them, for a section, the intonation just fell out, or the tuning on a guitar, it was just a little different. But if you take the right take, there it is, it pops in. Or it's a lot easier to just subtly tune than having a much larger issue across the whole take. So that's a really good point too when it comes to everything, like just like we'll talk about not mixing in solo, right? When we get there, also kind of like don't always necessarily tune in solo when you're deciding on your final comps, because we want, like you said, that hierarchy of like energy and the timbre of a thing. But then like rhythmic and tuning are the last things. But like if you can pick one that if every take feels really good with those top three, then go with the one that maybe like just feels the best in context when it comes to the tuning and the pitch of certain instruments, because that'll save you a lot more of like extra work and having to like add layers of processing into something, especially if it's a style of music where you're trying to keep it sounding really natural and organic, you know? And there have been plenty of times where it's just like, if there's a vocal take that goes kind of flat, but like the guitar was also flat, it's like all of a sudden, if you take that vocal and put it with a different guitar, you know, take where he was tuned up, it doesn't really work. It doesn't have the same magic, you know? So trying to avoid those things and just and picking out these comps and doing these edits in context, I think is really important to remember as well. But so let's talk when we get kind of, you know, past, say we've picked all of all of the comps for everything all the way down the arrangement. And, you know, everything's been chopped up. Just like the fundamentals beyond that is kind of going through and combing through all of your punch points. You know, sometimes it can get really granular if we're talking about, you know, a style of music where you're kind of like using some sort of like, you know, beat detection software, really chopping things up, you know, note by note in a certain section for a certain reason to elicit an effect. You know, you're going to have a lot of punch points, and it's important to go ahead and make sure you're getting your crossfades right and you're cleaning all of that up and listening through to these things so that you don't send tracks down that are committed that have weird edit points in them or have weird pops or glitches because something got nudged or something got moved. So, you know, that's a really important one too that I don't think should be overlooked. And sometimes it's really easy to just kind of, especially when you have a lot going on or it's very, you know, editing can get really monotonous, but definitely just listen down to the individual instruments before you commit them, you know, before you commit them down, I think is also good. Just to make sure you're not missing any of those things. Cause those are things that are tough for a mix engineer to, you know, you can't really undo and you shouldn't be asking them to undo that. Or for yourself, you know, that'll be annoying if you then have to go back and do a different session and bounce it out or something, you know.
And also like know the limitations of what you're working on, as far as like if you're comping and you're relying on like this certain EQ or you're doing a certain tuning like Melodyne or something, if you send that over as a new audio file with that printed on it, rather than being like, here's the session, here's this Melodyne file. Sometimes it may not transfer, and I assume that nothing will transfer when you're doing these editing consolidations. So like if you were to give the song to a mix engineer, everything should line up at 0 and everything should fly in, and you have it all right there. So they don't have to do any fixing.
Right. Don't assume. And that's a great point too. Normally this, you know, this would probably be communicated. And we'll talk about this in a second. But like, don't assume that whoever you're working with is using the same DAW or is, you know, you know what I mean? Is going to be in the same, if you're doing your stuff in Logic, don't assume that you're passing something to somebody. And if you're using like FlexTime or some other, you know, stock Logic plugin, don't assume that the mix engineer, that you can just send them a session and the mix engineer is going to open it up in Logic, right? So that's why it's good practice. And then if you want to, that's quite possible if you have that conversation, depending on the nature of the collaboration. But yeah, I think that's great, is consolidating everything and zeroing them out so that you should be able to open up a folder, select all of those tracks and import them to individual tracks in any DAW, and they should just line up all together right from the start. And you should immediately be able to press play and hear down the track. Nothing should be like, wait, why is that out of time? Wait, that's strange. And then also, you know, if we're talking about edits or corrections or heavy-handed things, the vocal should be tuned. And if you're the artist and you're taking care of that, that's your job, you know. Like don't confuse it that like tuning or some editing is part of the mixing process, you know, which is sometimes it's just like, it's an interesting thing, I think, a lot too, because the conversation starts to come up that, and I always talk about it, you know, like a vocal tuning thing. The tuning and the pitch is sometimes what helps it sink back into the mix, that little extra bit. But you should never leave anything as though like, hey, well, I thought you were going to like tune this harder, you know, and part of the processing. No, if you should go through it and the vocal should be sitting from a pitch and rhythmic standpoint where you think it is the strongest and where you know, are happy with it before it goes out the door. So that's
probably a good question for you guys as like mix engineers as well. Or, I mean, as both, you know, tracking and mixing engineers, when you guys are sending out your stems to whoever is going to be mixing, or when you guys receive a set of stems, are you expecting that when you fly that in with all the faders at zero, as you know, whoever the mix engineer is getting it, that they will hear basically a like rough static mix of what it is that you're working with?
Tom, I'll let you go. I have my own thoughts on this, but
yeah. So I mean, like, short answer is, I'd probably say no, because like if everything's like recording to like a proper level, then the proper level of recording may not yield the proper level of the balance.
Right.
But if, let's say, like you're working in Pro Tools and I receive a track that's a Pro Tools file, which is great, if that is like balanced how they like it, and also I always ask for like a demo, and that way you get the idea of what they want to focus on, because sometimes what I focus on is a different interpretation than what the artists focus on, and finding a way to balance both of those is huge and an important part of mixing, and that's where it gets creative, is the interpretation of that. So short answer is, if it stems, I never expect it. If it's, or don't want to expect it. If it's like tracked stems, so like I'm talking like a drum kit, I'm talking like that kind of stuff where it's like a full band. Now, if it's like a pop production, like Adam's stuff that you do, that's kind of a different story, because if we're not dealing with like noise floor and we're dealing with like a lot of samples and a lot of that stuff, well, maybe that's a different story. If you have a rough mix going on and you're printing that down in Logic, then yeah, why not? But as far as like if it's a live recording of sorts, maybe let's call it that. If there's like live recording elements in it, then I don't expect it to be the stems to be the level. If it's a pop production, maybe there's a little bit more of expectation to that, like the level that you get on the stems is approximately where they are, unless they're like completely in the bucket, like minus 30 dB down or minus 40 dB down. Maybe not that, but
yeah. No, what do you think? Yeah, I'd be inclined to agree that I would say I don't necessarily expect the blank tracks to be to all fit together in like a rough mix approach. And in fact, I know a lot of engineers, and I've kind of started doing this a little bit, and adjusting my process and playing around with some different approaches, just in the sake of consistency and convenience and overall routing. Just to save myself time sometimes, but then also to like kind of be able to compare, things one for one. You'll see a lot of engineers that they will get tracks, and whether it's an assistant or themselves, they will prep the raw tracks or prep their mix session by going through and regain staging and clip gaining down everything so that it's kind of peaking at the same point. And a lot of this kind of comes about because they're trying to give themselves additional headroom. If it's a track that a song that has a lot of tracks, right? Say it's like has like 6-8 different rhythm guitars in the chorus, and synths and layered bass and like crazy vocal stacks, right? If all of those things are like coming in and recorded at the optimal level and are stacked on top of each other, you're going to run out of headroom in a DAW real quick,
perceived headroom.
Right.
I just want to, because if you're running 24-bit,
sure,
you will definitely clip. If you're running 32-bit,
right,
if you clip and you hear the clipping, there's something wrong.
Right,
with you.
right. So I guess for the
just wanted to preface that. Sorry.
No, that's okay, and that's a great point, Tom. But yes, so that